trade war heats up. Trump versus EU tariffs explained. The full picture. Behind the transatlantic trade clash. When discussing modern trade wars, the U.S.-China conflict typically takes center stage. However, another, less publicized but equally impactful battle has emerged on the global stage: the trade war between the United States and the European Union. This confrontation, fueled by ideological differences and deep economic grievances, intensified under the leadership of former U.S. President Donald J. Trump. With aggressive tariffs and public statements that reshaped diplomacy, Trump redefined how America engages with even its closest allies. This trade war is not simply about numbers and goods. It's a reflection of shifting global power dynamics, nationalism, and a reevaluation of the rules that have governed international trade since World War II. At its core, it asks a pressing question: can traditional alliances survive in an age of transactional politics? To understand the intensity of the current trade dispute, one must examine its roots. The trade imbalance between the U.S. and EU has been a long-standing issue. The United States imports significantly more from Europe than it exports, creating a substantial trade deficit. European exports such as German automobiles, French wines, and luxury consumer goods flood the American market. Meanwhile, U.S. goods face higher tariffs and regulatory hurdles in the European bloc. Under Trump's America First doctrine, such imbalances were deemed unacceptable. He argued that America's allies were exploiting outdated trade agreements that no longer reflected modern realities. While prior administrations had raised concerns diplomatically, Trump's administration chose direct confrontation. In March 2018, the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on imported steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum, citing national security. Although targeted broadly, the EU was among the hardest hit. European leaders were stunned. The justification seemed flimsy, given the EU's status as a longtime NATO ally. The EU responded with tariffs of its own, strategically aimed at iconic American products such as Harley-Davidson motorcycles, bourbon whiskey, and Levi's jeans. These products weren't chosen at random. They were symbolic of American identity and production hubs in pro-Trump regions. The trade war had officially begun. Tensions deepened in 2019 when the U.S. won a case at the World Trade Organization against the EU, which had been found to provide illegal subsidies to aircraft manufacturer Airbus. The ruling allowed the U.S. to impose $7.5 billion in retaliatory tariffs, the largest in WTO history, on European goods. Products like Italian cheese, Spanish olives, and Scottish whiskey were targeted. Europe retaliated a year later, after winning its own WTO case against the U.S. over subsidies to Boeing. The EU imposed $4 billion in tariffs on American exports, escalating the tit-for-tat retaliation. These legal victories did little to ease tensions. Instead, they highlighted how both economic giants were willing to weaponize international institutions to gain leverage. Trump's approach to trade wasn't just economic, it was deeply geopolitical. He viewed the EU, particularly Germany, as an economic competitor hiding behind the veil of partnership. He criticized NATO allies for underinvesting in defense and accused Europe of enjoying a trade surplus at America's expense. To Trump, tariffs were not merely tools of economic protection. They were instruments of power, used to force renegotiation and assert dominance. This marked a stark shift from decades of multilateralism to a new era of bilateral bargaining. So who benefited from the trade war? In the short term, some U.S. industries, particularly steel and aluminum, gained from reduced competition. Domestic production received a temporary boost. However, downstream industries that rely on these raw materials saw increased costs, which were ultimately passed on to consumers. Small businesses, especially those in manufacturing and agriculture, bore the brunt of the economic fallout. Many found themselves squeezed between rising import costs and shrinking export markets. On the European side, exporters in agriculture, automotive, and luxury goods faced major setbacks. Some companies were forced to cut jobs, shift supply chains, or absorb losses. In response, the EU intensified efforts to diversify export markets, building stronger ties with Asia and Latin America. The Trump tariffs served as a wake-up call for the EU. European policymakers began advocating for strategic autonomy, a vision of an EU less reliant on the US for economic and defense stability. Initiatives to strengthen European military capabilities, invest in local tech, and protect critical industries gained momentum. Ironically, Trump's aggression may have accelerated Europe's push for independence, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. Unlike the U.S.-China rivalry, the U.S.-EU conflict is entangled in shared history, democratic values, and common security interests. This makes it both less explosive and more dangerous. When traditional allies feud, it signals a broader unraveling of the global order. Trust between Washington and Brussels has eroded. Although President Biden sought to restore transatlantic ties, the scars of Trump-era tariffs remain. Future administrations may rekindle trade hostilities, particularly if Trump or a similar populist figure returns to power. The transatlantic trade war's consequences ripple far beyond the involved parties. Disrupted supply chains, rising commodity prices, and global inflation are already visible. Countries that depend on exports to both markets, especially developing nations, suffer collateral damage. The trade war also weakens the global rules-based system, encouraging other nations to act unilaterally. If trade conflicts become the norm, economic nationalism could replace cooperation, making international crises, such as climate change or future pandemics, harder to address. The Trump-EU tariff war is more than a dispute over products and prices. It's a symbol of an emerging world where economic might is used as a political weapon. It marks the decline of traditional alliances and the rise of transactional diplomacy. Will the U.S. and EU find a way back to cooperation? Or will this trade war become a permanent feature of global politics? Much depends on whether leaders on both sides can move beyond nationalism and recognize their shared interests. This trade conflict is a warning. If global powers fail to manage competition with dialogue and respect, the whole world could pay the price.